the reason that I know about Raising Arizona, because you had brought up that you weren't sure how you hadn't seen it or heard about it, and the only reason I know
Right.
anything about it is because this is like one of my dad's favorite movies. He quotes from it. He's big into it. I didn't realize actually that it is a Coen brothers movie until
Right.
I sort of sat down to work on this episode of the show. But I was conscious of the fact that like there's a lot more in here than I ever understood when I was first shown this movie at like 14 or 15 or something.
It was really weird for me. So like, I mean, I knew beforehand going in that it was a Coen Brothers movie. So it was really weird watching it, having seen No Country for Old Men, which
Yeah,
is like one of my favorite movies ever.
there's a kind of like a comedic, it's like a comedic parallel almost to that story.
Just because I was trying to get as much background information as I could on the film, and someone was kind of comparing it, kind of making this sort of like duality, sort of kind of comparison between the two, yin and yang sort of thing,
Right.
which I thought was an interesting sort of take on the two films. You know, I mean, they like their western and that genre, but it sort of struck me just how goofy the film was for the time period and the pacing, and like I don't know, I'm not entirely well versed on filmmaking history, particularly like in that time period. And one of my thoughts as I was watching it was like, had a film been made that way at that time, you know, just like I was sort of thinking about like the character of Leonard Smalls, and like when they're kind of like first introducing him, and there's that scene, I think it's the dream sequence, when he's going on that monologue about him, and there's these quick sort of intercuts of like just like fiery hell basically,
Mm-hmm.
just like super fast,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes back to quiet, and just there's elements of like of that I'm like, I don't remember ever seeing like filmmaking like this in like an 80s movie before. So I just thought it was kind of cool.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it makes use of dreamscapes in a way that is definitely indie. Like that I think might you could probably get away with a little more in mainstream film today, right? But I think that it's at its time that sort of surrealist something in a movie that made $29 million
There was
is
almost this like Adam McKay thing going on in it, like
mm,
a sort of a predecessor to his style that I really enjoyed.
mhm. Just a little bit absurdist, and I think that
Yeah.
like okay, so let's set it up a little bit. So
Mhm.
the film Raising Arizona, Coen Brothers, starring Nick Cage, John Goodman is in this. It's from 1987, right? And it has and it's an indie film that did it like incredibly well. I mean, they probably spent like nothing making this thing, and then they made $30 million globally or something. So that's sort of your context. The story basically follows High and his wife Ed, who meet as High is sort of in and out of prison, and then conspire together to steal the whatever it is, the quintuplet child of like the local like furniture store owning
The
guy,
local
right?
Baron. Yeah. Yeah, the Baron of Tempe. Yeah.
What you have in it, I think, is I mean, first of all, it's a lot about class, right?
Yeah.
And as we'll sort of show as we're going through this and everything. But I think that like structurally, it bears kind of this resemblance to a lot of the like fiction and media about like middle class Victorian people and the
Mhm.
sort of weird like idiosyncrasies of like 19th century British folks
Yeah.
who had to do all these kind of sort of strange things and did all of these strange things to sort of like put on the to put on the airs of a class that they weren't quite a part of, right, but that they
Right.
could pretend to by dressing and behaving in a certain way. And this is sort of like the American Western version of that genre
Yeah.
of like Victorian class tales and fiction.
Okay, so something that I thought was interesting as I was after I had finished the film, I wanted to go through as many like Reddit threads as I could, just seeing what other people thought about the film. Because
Mm,
I really enjoyed it, and after I watched the film, I went on to Reddit basically to just get as many different sort of opinions on the film and look through what discussions are out there on the internet. And like what you just said there, I found like very little discussion on the film's sort of like critique of class and things like that. It was kind of mind boggling to me a little bit because I'm like, it was almost one of those things where I was questioning my own sort of like take on the film, where I was like, is this really intentional by the Coen brothers? And I thought
hmm
that was peculiar because that was very striking for me as I watched it.
I mean, I have found some stuff that's a lot about like at the intersection of like class and gender, and sort of pointing out High's wife Ed. There's that scene where they've stolen the baby, right? And they've invited High's boss, his foreman, over with his wife to have some lunch. And like as Dot, who is the boss's wife, is like explaining all about like, dip tats and savings accounts for colleges and sort of all of these things that the baby needs to have in order for Ed and High to pretend to middle class status, right? You have Ed like looking to High as like the person who's supposed to be like sort of in charge of all of these sorts of things and aware of all of this, and that there's this that there are different gender roles at different levels of class and all of these sorts of things. So I saw a little bit of that, but I think you're right. I think that maybe not surprisingly that this movie in 1987 that this was sort of missed, but I think that what you have in Raising Arizona is sort of four levels of American
Mm-hmm.
society in the modern American West, right? So you have, at the top, you have the Arizonas, right, who are like German immigrants who have like changed their
Right.
last name.
Yeah.
They're presented as sort of the sort of this apex comedically at kind of the social apex of Tempe, Arizona, right? It doesn't get any higher than being like the furniture salesman with the big loud commercials on TV, right? And so that's
Yeah.
funny,
He's
but
the local
they're
mayor.
meant
Yeah.
right. They're meant to represent this sort of bourgeois element, and then you have High's boss and his wife, Glenn and Dot. That's who High and Ed are trying to be, right? High and Ed are trying to be Glenn and Dot. And then you have Ed and High, who are, of this lower class, right?
Mm-hmm.
And are pretending to, true like middle class status, right? And then you have High's friends from his life in the bandit underclass, who are like the symbol of the Western bandit, basically, but in
Yeah. Yeah.
late 20th century. Okay, and that is who High is. Like High is actually
Mm-hmm.
of that class. Like the whole like sort of his arc in the movie is about trying to stop being that person who's in and out of prison in order to to have a wife and then to have a child, and then realizing that or fearing that he can't ever escape it, becoming, and then ultimately turning back to a life of crime, and sort of one of the climaxes of the movie, right? And but so within this, you have, as we had just sort of left off talking about before we got into the plot, you have Highs like at first you think like metaphorical like dreamscape of his
Mm-hmm.
conscience rebelling in the face of having stolen an infant, right?
Right.
So there's this kind of interesting thing as well that happens in it where it's like, so Ed can't conceive. High's wife Ed can't conceive, and actually neither could Dot or Florence, Arizona, right? So the two wives of the higher up the social scale were able to pay for the fertility treatments to
Mhm.
conceive, right? They were in basically Ed's
Yeah.
position as well.
Yeah.
And it's like, so like Glenn and Dot, they've got like four children and they're all awful. And then you have the Arizonas, right? The Barons, who, you know, had quintuplets, right, as a result of their fertility treatments, right? And so like the, you know, the children are sort of representing the attained class, you know, sort of
Hmm.
in this movie. And for people who have money, they're able to buy their way out of the critical, you know, challenge for Ed and High, which they
Yeah.
can't, which is you know, getting fertility treatments in order to conceive. So that's what drives them to steal the child, and that's when High has the dream about the biker, you know, who's leaving nothing but scorched earth in his wake, and at first seems very metaphorical, right? Like I think with it's not until Leonard Smalls literally comes in to Nathan Arizona's office and
Hmm.
says, "Hey, that $25,000 you're offering for reward here is $25,000 under what the market will pay for a child."
Hmm.
And so
Right.
he's like, "I'm going to find this kid, and if you'll pay me the market rate, I'll bring it back to you." Right. And at that moment, you realize that Leonard Smalls is like an actual person. It's not like a figment of High's dreamscape, but actually like a very real sort of embodiment of like the apex of the bandit underclass, of which High is actually a part of.
Leonard's character um was interesting to me because I mean I think there's a lot of discussion online about like, you know, what he represents. Is he simply just another physical person? Is he this like weird physical manifestation
Hmm.
of, you know, the darker side of High's, you know, conscious and all that? So that a lot of that's up for debate, but I tend to kind of go with the latter in the case of the film, you know, just because he sort of demonstrates obviously these, you know, seemingly supernatural, you know, fighting abilities
Hmm.
and, you know, spawning matches out of thin air or sleight of hand tricks like that and all that. But he was a really compelling, I want to use the word almost elemental like villain,
Hmm.
very much in the same way. And I thought this was super interesting having seen No Country for Old Men, but Anton Chigurh
Right.
is very much like this character in that they're like Anton's not doesn't doesn't demonstrate like supernatural characteristics like I think like Leonard Smalls does kind of in this film. They both sort of represent this like seemingly like sort of like unstoppable force
Hmm.
that seems these forces of nature that represent, I don't know if you want to use the word evil, but we'll just say that they both just represent these forces of nature with this sort of like very singular goal
Hmm.
basically, and they're going to pursue it until their own end. Because in the film, like Leonard Smalls is doing that for the baby. In No Country for Old Men, Anton Chigurh is like has this just entire super singular goal of getting the money back for, you know, for the cartel money that's, and he gets rid of, you know, anyone and everything in his path to
Hmm.
achieve that goal. And so, you know, and Leonard Smalls, like I said, kind of follows the same sort of path a little bit in this film.
I think that the biggest difference between the two, between Anton Chigurh and Leonard Smalls, is, I mean, kind of goes to the core of like what the differences in the morals of what was what originally the book No Country for Old Men that became the
Yeah,
movie, and then the sort of overarching moral of Raising Arizona. Chigurh in No Country for Old Men represents just an unhinged, irrational depravity of modernity, right? Like
sure.
the point of that movie is that it's like, you know, the old west has been replaced by like the depravity of urbanity.
Yeah, I mean that's what Tommy Lee Jones's
Right.
character is. You know, he's commenting
Exactly.
on that the entire movie. Yeah, and so
Exactly.
that's he's the one kind of laying it out for the audience, like, hey, this is the point of the movie
Right. But I think that, yeah, exactly. But
the
I
whole
think
time. Yeah,
that Leonard Smalls represents the self-interested depravity that lives in all of the characters in that movie,
hmm,
right? You know, you have the Arizonas, right, who are self-interestedly depraved in sort of a classic sort of bourgeois way, right? You know, who wants to who wants to buy furniture from a guy with a German last name, right? Like,
Yeah.
and sort of that. And it's like they're not even they're offering half the market rate for their their stolen white child. All the employees are he admits to the cops like all of his employees are like disgruntled and all this sort of thing. So this sort of
Yeah.
very kind of like recognizable self-interested depravity at the top end of the class system in Tempe, right? Then you have Glenn and Dot, right, who are meant to embody sort of everything that Ed and High want, but they're swingers, and that ends up being like the thing that breaks down that burgeoning friendship, right? Is that
Yeah.
Glenn like offers to wife swap with High, and for
Yeah.
High, who is meant to represent sort of this like like yeah, like he's the underclass, right? But he doesn't have sort of these like crunchy like liberal modern urbane like values, right? Like he wouldn't he wouldn't do something like that. The managerial class is depraved because they're beset by these sort of non-traditionalist values, and that ends up being sort of the thing that kind of sets off the rising action of the movie, or sort of the rise to the climax is High punching his boss in the nose. His boss, who is like making all these like horrifying like ethnic jokes about Polish people, and then that's fine, right? High's like whatever, but it's at the point at which Glenn wants to wife swap. That's the line for High, right? It's not the jokes about the Polacks, right? It's the
Hmm.
wife swapping. So he hits him in the face, right? And of course, High and Ed have their there's the things that High and Ed are willing to do to try to have this normal existence, this idealized middle class existence, which are self-interestedly depraved in a different way than what we see with the
Yeah.
Arizonas and Glenn and Dot.
Yeah.
And then you have Dale and Evel, who are the underbelly, and they are just unabashedly, of the bandit class
Hmm.
in that you could identify across westerns as a genre in general. But even they have their code, their ethos gets undermined because after they steal Nathan Jr., they end up being touched by him and falling for this baby and all this sort of stuff. And so it's like
Yeah.
and actually have their self-interested depravity like alleviated by and they become sympathetic in a way they never have been
Right.
when through this relationship that they end up having with Nathan Jr. after they've done
Yeah.
sort of the most depraved thing in the movie,
Hmm.
as depraved as Leonard Smalls, by stealing the child to sell. But this is the difference between the ethic in No Country for Old Men and the ethic in Raising Arizona, which is No Country for Old Men is about like the depravity that's out there, right? That good people are trying to avoid. And Raising Arizona is about the depravity that lives in everyone.
So another film, and this is something that another film I would love to review at some point, is Taylor Sheridan's Hell or High Water that came out in 2016. Another Western, but I believe it's actually modern. I don't think it's set. It came out in 2016, but I do think it's like, I mean, it's set like in that time period. Whereas like
Mm,
No Country for Old Men came out in 2007, but it was set in like 1980.
yeah.
So without like kind of veering too far away from this film and talking about Hell or High Water, but that film itself, has a lot of commentary on class and the bandit class, as you put it, because in the film, basically these two brothers go on a bank robbing spree in Texas, West
Hmm.
Texas. But they're, without kind of spoiling it, they're using the money to fund a sort of morally gray, possibly righteous cause, essentially. And there's it, yeah. My thought earlier was there's this really sort of common theme where we see a lot of westerns like that film, this film, No Country for Old Men, use the western genre to talk about class,
Hmm.
and like what, and so I'm curious like why you think that is. Why is that? Why has that become an easy sort of setting for filmmakers, writers to use when they want to talk about inequality, urbanization, and stuff like
Hmm.
that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think if it's unintentional, then it's just because even people who would count themselves as pro-capitalist, but like critical of modernity, have to acknowledge the way that like traditionalism is broken down by capitalism, right? I mean, this is the reason that like historically conservatism hasn't been associated with capitalism, right? Like if you know like Edmund Burke was a monarchist, right? Like conservatism, you know, with like a capital C, is about preserving traditionalism. And so there's a consciousness among conservatives that of this fact, right, that capitalism is a corrosive substance on these traditional um, elements of society, right? It's the
Mhm.
reason that it's like, you know, Glenn and Dot, you know, are everything that High and Ed are like pretending to and think that they're supposed to want, you know, in society and everything, but they have been, you know, corrupted by the urbanity of polygamy, right? Like
Mhm.
that's what we're kind of supposed to see here, right? And that it's like this is sort of the inescapable tide of modernity, right? And
Mhm.
that and I think that if it's unintentional in westerns, like that's what it is. But you know, I think that uh, it might be unavoidable, you know, because you can't talk about the West and the West being won or lost or situating a story in a deeply transitory place, not just like physically, like the American West, but historically, right? This is the West is a place of deep transition. You know, it's a place of being unmoored from social structures, right? It's
Mhm.
a place where you can think a whole lot about like what makes people people and what makes society society. And in doing so, it's impossible not to talk about and think about class.
Obviously, to me, the more sort of like readily apparent component of the Western genre and why filmmakers might want to use it. I mean, specifically, I'm kind of thinking in the case of like Hell or High Water. There's a lot of let me put it this way: a lot of the film's cinematography focuses on the sort of like decay of these Western towns in Texas and
Right.
stuff like that, and then it really pans toward big shiny fancy banks
Mm-hmm.
and all that. But it's everything else about the town is run down and
Right.
all that. So it's for me, like I wonder, is it more so just are a lot of these filmmakers, making their own commentary
Mm-hmm.
on capitalism, for example,
Mm-hmm.
in really sort of in illustrating that because it's very easy to make a commentary on that. Simply, I mean, there's no like for example, like I said in Hell or High Water, the much of the cinematography is a focus on decay. It's very easy
Mm-hmm.
to have a commentary on capitalism in a Western film like that
Right.
simply through the cinematography.
I think it's interesting to think like, okay, so in like the mid 20th century,
Hmm.
a lot of westerns are set in like the end of the 19th century, like with the closing of the frontier,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And that is often sort of what your protagonists are kind of struggling against. You know, it's not just the indigenous native other, right? But it's also, you know, the intrusion of modernity on the frontier, right? And this sort of reconciling this very real social crisis in the United States at the end of the 19th century, which was, you know, a not unreasonable assumption that what had made the United States a cohesive society was that you could opt out, right? That you could just leave and go be out there, right? And so there's this one of the big things that drives U.S. towards the United States towards its modern imperialism is this like anxiety about like, if there's not a frontier out there, if we don't
Right.
have that, then what will any of this even work? Is that not the basis for the society itself? And so I think that the modern Western posits that the new frontier is the wasteland created by neoliberalism, by the end of industrialism, right? That the promises of the closed frontier and its benefits, right, have left behind a different kind of wasteland, a different kind of frontier. And I think that that may be what the modern Western meditates on, is this sort of constructing a new frontier, a new West, in sort of the rotting husk of the promises of capitalism and industrialism and modernity and urbanity. I see. I always think Cormac McCarthy wrote that book like ages ago, and that is a 2005
No,
novel.
it's very deceiving in that way. It
Yeah,
seems like it. Yeah, no,
yeah.
100%.
Cormac
100%.
McCarthy. So I mean, it would be really interesting to ask
Mhm.
Cormac McCarthy, like, what do you think about Raising Arizona?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Um,
I always have that in my mind, that it's like, oh yeah, No Country for Old Men, yeah, it was written in in the time it's set,
sure.
basically, and
The
not yeah.
the Coen brothers make really good Western films, ultimately. I mean, let's be for real here. And so the other thing, I for some reason thought that this was their first film together. Wrong. They made the film Blood Simple. I don't know if you've seen that in
No.
1984, which was this kind of like dark crime film, basically. And so I think sort of the commentary that I was reading on the internet after I watched this was, it kind of shocked people, that they made that film and then they come out and they make Raising Arizona, which was this crazy stark contrast,
Yeah.
with Blood Simple, which is cool. I mean, that's it's cool to have that kind of
Mhm.
diversity in your filmmaking arsenal. But and then, like, to have this film and then you pair it sort of with No Country for Old Men, which are both westerns, but you know, tonally
Mhm.
opposite. Oh, the chase scene
Oh my god! And I think
was
that it's worth
wonderful.
pausing. I think it's worth pausing here at the half hour mark in this episode, and just saying that yeah, that it's like, this movie is fucking funny. And yeah, and
Yeah.
you've got John Goodman, but it's like Holly Hunter, who plays Cage's wife, like, has won an
Mhm.
Oscar.
I also just want to say too, I mean, this is like easily honestly my favorite film I've ever seen Nicolas Cage in. I mean, it is it was so weird to watch him in his young form in this movie compared to what we've seen elsewhere.
Sure, yeah, and it's like, and every now and then it's like, I think what's important with Nick Cage is to like just imagine like him doing the things he's doing and acting the way he's acting. Like, if you were just like in a like standing like slightly offset and just watching someone do it, I think you can be like, oh, that would be kind of crazy. So I'm reading this thing, and so it's like there is kind of like a biblical thing in this story, right? There, it does kind of have this sort of like this kind of mythic quality to it, and that it owes some homage to like Homer and like some biblical stories. But it's funny because I'm just trying to look for like references to No Country for Old Men in this. It seems like whoever is writing this article on screenrant.com also
Mhm.
lists Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men as something the Coens borrowed from for this. And we know that's not true. Cormac McCarthy's book does not come out for 18 years after this movie's been made. And it can't be like an accident that like Cormac McCarthy was like, oh, like that Cormac McCarthy would be unaware of Raising Arizona when he was giving over the rights to this. You know what I'm saying? Like to make No Country for Old Men. Like, there must have been like kind of a consciousness about it. But um nonetheless, it'd be funny to like,
I imagine he was a fan of this movie.
yeah.
So,
And that it may have played a role in what he wrote in No Country for Old Men. like I'm just imagining like my dad being like kind of grumpy at like, you know, because I remember like the last time I saw this movie, like with them, kind of like pointing these things out, right? And like, and it's like what's weird is that they're not super overt about the fact that like Glenn is High's boss either. It's like kind of like a throwaway line later. It's like they've
Right.
had these interactions,
Right.
and it's like
Right.
it's not till after he's hit him that Ed's like, hi, he's gonna fire you. Like you're gonna lose your job, and you're like, that's his boss. He's literally his boss. Like you know, to me at that point, it's like, how is this not like how does the rest of it not just kind of click into place? But I think that, you know, it would be possible for people who really love this movie to be kind of irritated about the seriousness of our tone here. And I think it's important to acknowledge that like this is at its core like a funny movie, and with
Mhm.
lots of quotables and memorable moments. That chase scene is incredible. You know, the moment where High steals the truck from the guy like mid chase, and he's wearing like you know, pantyhose on his head. He opens the door and like points the gun at the guy, and the guy looks at him. He goes, "Son, you got a panty on your head." It's something that my dad said like the entire time growing up.
Son, you got a panty on your head. You drive fast, eh?
Like, son, you got a panty on your head.
I
Or where he's in there having that scene where it's like Dale and Evil are getting the like supplies at the convenience store. This made me think of that scene at the convenience store between Sugar and the attendant and No Country for
uh-huh.
Old Men, that which is just like so like startling and cringe and slow and all of this sort of stuff. And you have kind of like structurally a very similar thing between Dale and Evil and the convenience store attendant, but it's like it's just drop dead hilarious.
Balloons. Hey, these blow up into funny shapes at all?
Well, no, unless round is funny.
When yeah, or like when he tells the guy to like count to five, like count to 500 or
Go back
whatever,
to 5 and
you
check
know,
to see
and they're
QH.
like, and they forget the baby. And he's driving.
Hurry up, open the door. He's a real cheerful little critter once he warms up to
Hurry
you.
up! I don't know how high this thing's going.
6 Mississippi, 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi, 9 Mississippi.
Got some baby grub, baby wipes. Got them diapers in disposable kind. I got me a packet of balloons.
They blow up into funny shapes at all?
No, just circular.
Say, where's Junior?
What do you mean you put them in?
No, I thought... Where'd we leave him?
801 Mississippi, 800 Mississippi. 791. Oh, bullshit. $790 off Mississippi.
I loved the sort of pointed like nature of how reckless the cop was that chased
Yeah,
I throughout the scene.
yeah,
Like just run it, just going after him and just firing a long nose barrel like revolver, just all over like in the convenience store, just firing it. Oh, it's great. And then how everyone that High like encounters throughout that entire like chase sequence like pulls out a gun
mm-hmm.
to get him.
Yeah,
Every store clerk pulls out like a rifle or like a revolver. It's just so great.
it's gold. It's gold. It probably cost nothing to make. Like you think about like chase scenes are often like crazy expensive like set pieces for movies, and like that one probably cost $3,000.
I think about like, for example, the chase scene in the newest Batman film with Pattinson.
Right.
There, I mean, there's a scene where he goes after Colin Farrell's Penguin, and to be fair, might be the best chase scene I've ever seen in film.
But it cost $12 million.
Yeah, that scene alone cost $12 million to me. So The sound of the Batmobile itself was
right.
So
Right. Yeah, no, this is a master class in how you can do a whole lot with very, very little.
yeah. Well, I mean, I was just looking at when I was talking about Hell or High Water earlier. And this is a film with like Jeff Bridges, Chris Pine, and like Ben Foster in it, like big name actors.
Mm-hmm.
And its budget was $12 million in 2016.
Well, there you go. It's just I mean, like, obviously it has homage, but I love like remembering that No Country for Old Men is a 2005 book, and the movie is 07, and like, and that it probably influenced Cormac McCarthy. You know, this was
Well,
probably
it's
like
an interesting sort of like progression to think about, because you have Raising Arizona, and then the possibility that Cormac McCarthy took a lot of influence from that film. Then he makes No Country for Old Men, and then he gets he gets them to direct his book that they had influence on, which is kind of cool, coming full circle like that.
This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPod and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.